Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to the latest of the Royal Institute of Philosophy's London lecture series on the theme of expanding horizons. And while people are still logging in and coming in, let me tell you a little bit more about the series and what we've got coming up. The idea of expanding horizons is simply that Western philosophy has often been criticised for much of the 20th century for being very narrow in its focus, and we're really looking at and celebrating and encouraging various different ways in which the discipline has been expanding its horizons, whether that's in terms of its subject matter, the questions it asks, or where in the world it looks to try and find inspiration and ideas. The slide on you can see now is telling you what we've had this side of Christmas. We've already had three really interesting talks, and today we're going to hear from Noburu Notomi. If we were in Japan, we'd say Notomi Noburu. The convention in Japan, as it is in many East Asian countries, is for the family name to come first. He's going to be talking about Japanese philosophers on Plato's ideas. Normally these talks are in the evening. We're at lunchtime because of the time zone in Tokyo. We're very grateful to Professor Notomi for joining us at what is about 9 p.m. his time. Coming up next week, we have Nilanjan Das talking about the first person in Buddhism. And after that, we have Eileen John on Can Aesthetics Be Global? That will conclude the first half of this series. We're going to resume again in February, and we'll be putting details of all those talks online soon. In fact, the titles and speakers are already at the website of the Royal Institute of Philosophy. But we do more than just that. We had our annual debate last week, which you can find on our YouTube channel. Coming up 29th of November, I think that's Monday at 8 p.m, we have our annual London lecture, and that's being given this year by Sally Haslanger on systemic, structural and institutional injustice. What's the difference? And in recent years, the London lecture has been going for quite a while, but in recent years we've also had annual lectures in Edinburgh, Cardiff and in Dublin, and the Edinburgh annual lecture is going to be held on the 6th of December. Our speaker there is Heather Douglas on differentiating scientific inquiry and politics, a highly topical question if ever there was one. But today, as I say, we have Noburu Notomi talking about Japanese philosophers on Plato. Let me say a bit about Professor Notomi. He's professor at the Graduate School of Humanities and Sociology at the University of Tokyo. And he specialises in Western ancient philosophy. And in his career, he's been in many different universities. He's currently in Tokyo, as we said, but he actually did a PhD in classics at the University of Cambridge under Miles Berniak. People might know him. And his many published works in Japanese and in English. His most notable work is The Unity of Plato's Sophist, published by Cambridge University Press. Before we hear the talk, let me just give a little bit of background for people who may perhaps be a little less familiar with this, or it's been a while since they've been doing their Plato. One of the key ideas we're looking at here is a way of understanding Plato's theory of forms. That's the way it's often described, the theory of forms. It's referred to here as the theory of ideas or transcendent forms. And this idea is that there are, if you like, for every particular thing that exists, there are lots of particular dogs, for example. But for all these things to be dogs, there must be some kind of universal form of the dog, which they all somehow participate in, and it makes them dogs. And this idea is deeply unfashionable, I would say, in contemporary philosophy, in part because it seems to imply some kind of what we might call a dualism, that there are all the dogs in the world, and then there's this other kind of thing, the form of the dog. And Aristotle made that kind of objection to Plato many years ago as his contemporary. So that's the kind of the sort of background of the subject matter. So when you think about Plato's theory of ideas, it's that theory of forms. And Noburu's going to look at various different ways in which we think about this, particularly in the West, and some Japanese alternatives perhaps. And there is, for example, an emphasis on the empiricist approach in Western philosophy, this idea that everything must be based on observation and evidence, and whether or not this perhaps has led to a kind of prejudice against the theory of ideas, which is assumed not to be empirical. And he's also going to talk a bit about what he refers to as the self-identical ego. And by this, he really means that this idea that the self is something kind of fixed, unchanging, there's some kind of permanent essence that exists through time. This idea of the self as this kind of irreducible essence of being. So that's a little bit of background for you. So the theme has been expanding horizons. And I think if you expand horizons, then you're going to expose yourself to some views which are going to seem unfamiliar, perhaps even difficult. But I think that when you listen to this talk, you'll find that if you thought you knew basically what Plato was and how to think about him, actually there are some very different ways of thinking about Plato, which are well worth taking more seriously. So we're going to hear the talk and then we're going to have a discussion. And if you've got any questions, please feed them in. Those questions may be for further elaboration or they may be critical questions. It's completely up to you. But first, let's have the talk.
It is a great honor and pleasure to give a talk at the London lectures. I wish I could stand in front of you in London. I'm in Yokohama, Japan. Today, I will talk about Japanese philosophers on Plato's ideas. I pronounce ideas instead of ideas. In this talk, the names of Japanese are given in the order of family name first and then the given name, like Noburu Notomi, not Noburu Notomi, but Notomi Noburu in this talk. So, first, reading Plato in the 21st century. Plato has long been one of the most important philosophers and even regarded as the greatest philosopher in Western Europe and North America. He has also been a major figure in Eastern Europe, Latin America, Near East and Middle East, and East Asia. Today, I'd like to discuss Plato from Japanese perspective. My discussion will show that although Platonic studies are an important part of philosophical activities in the academic world, modern readers miss some essential element in analyzing Plato's text and thoughts. What I believe we are missing is a correct understanding of his central thesis. Plato acknowledged the theory of ideas, transcendental forms, proposed in Plato's Middle Dialogues, as a major contribution to the history of philosophy. But only a few philosophers ascribe to it any actual role in contemporary philosophy. It appears to be considered simply as a bizarre doctrine that ignores our reality. Platonic transcendence or dualism is regarded as a negative heritage to overcome in modern philosophy. If it is only of historical interest, the relevance of Plato to our philosophy today clearly diminishes greatly. I hope that my Japanese background will shed some light on how to read Plato today. I see four assumptions of modern philosophy that prevent us from correctly understanding the theory of ideas. First, the implicit basis in considering reality. Second, the modern epistemology of the self-identical ego. Third, the devaluation of the image and imagination. And fourth, the confinement of philosophy in academic world. The theory of ideas has long been a target of severe criticism by many philosophers, from Aristotle to Nietzsche and postmodernism. Of several types of criticism, the most important and recurring one is that the ideas are redundant metaphysical entities added unnecessarily to this world. Therefore, the theory is mistaken. The first severe critic, Aristotle, raises 23 points against the theory of ideas in the Metaphysics. Aristotle argued that Plato added extra entities to the things in our world by positing one idea over many things. This corresponds, for example, to the hypothesis of ideas in the Phaedo. Socrates first hypothesizes that the beautiful itself by itself, that is, the idea of the beautiful, exists, and that if anything else is beautiful beside the beautiful itself, it is beautiful for no reason at all other than that it participates in that beautiful. Here, Socrates appears to add an extra entity to the things already existent in our world. According to the principle of the economy of thought, or Occam's razor, the hypothesis of ideas as separate entities is unphilosophic and a mistake. In this way, the separation of the ideas from sensible things became a focus of Aristotle's criticism. Modern philosophers raise similar questions to Plato. For example, Gail Fine, one of the representative scholars of ancient philosophy, asks, quote, "Are there universals independently of sensible object?" And she argues that if, as Aristotle and I believe, forms are universal, then to say that they are separate is to say that they can exist uninstantiated by sensible particulars. I believe that such questions and views fail to grasp the core of Plato's philosophy. But before judging its validity, we should note on what assumption this criticism is based. I examine the four main backgrounds. First, I find Aristotle, whom Fine mentions, standing firm on the empiricist basis in considering reality. This particular man or horse is a primary being, while kinds like man, horse, and animals are secondary. Accordingly, he regarded a mathematical object as mere abstract from concrete things, in contrast with Plato, who placed them at the highest level, higher than sensible things. Generally speaking, the empiricist position, including modern and Anglo-Analytic philosophy, is reluctant to admit anything other than that what we experience and perceive in this world with our body. Second, modern philosophers are more inclined to accept this criticism because of another assumption. In modern philosophy, the cognitive subject I, is fixed as the sole viewpoint from which I perceive objects and experience the world, such as Descartes' ego or res cogitans, Kant's Apperception, or Ich selbst and Husserl's transcendentale Subjektivität. These assumptions together raise a severe criticism of Plato's ideas. If the cognitive subject is fixed as self-identical, and if the reality is what we experience in this world, then the ideas are nothing but abstract objects postulated in vain. They are redundant, and the theory is erroneous. Seen from this empiricist and modern epistemological point of view, Plato's dualism is simply doubling the realities. What is missing in modern epistemology is a consideration of the possibility of change or transformation of I, although continental philosophers such as Hegel, Nietzsche, and Heidegger consider this possibility. Under different cognitive states, the world may also change. Third, the devaluation of the image and imagination prevents us from understanding the theory of ideas in a proper way. Plato has been criticized as a notorious, iconoclastic philosopher in the history of Western philosophy, since in addition to notorious criticism of poets in Republic Book 10, he locates the power of imaging at the lowest level of the epistemological hierarchy. However, it is not Plato, but we, modern readers, who are deeply involved in the negative view of the image by assuming that it comes from Plato, metaphysics. To approach the ideas, we need to rehabilitate our conception of the image and imagination. Fourth, the notion of philosophy is different between Plato and our contemporary world. Modern universities all over the world have departments of philosophy where professional philosophers and students engage in academic research on philosophical problems and the history of philosophy. However, in antiquity, philosophy was not so much as academic research as a way of life. So while the theory of ideas was also not a pure theory, but a practice of living well, we can scarcely find any philosophy reading it in this way in contemporary universities. 2. Plato's philosophy as shaping our conception of reality. SAKABE Megumi taught at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Tokyo and re-evaluated Japanese traditional thought to reconsider modern Western philosophy. He was one of the academic scholars who first introduced postmodern philosophers into Japan and took their attempts seriously. From this postmodern concern, he was naturally critical towards Platonism as a main target to overturn. But instead of replacing the traditional Platonic thinking with a new trend, SAKABE tried to shake its basis by recalling the deep unconscious cultural resources that are common in Europe, especially in ancient Greece, and the East. He also pursued the philosophical potentiality of the Japanese thought, including Yamato kotoba, namely native Japanese words, to reconsider or relativize Western philosophy. In the collection of essays, Hermeneutics of the Mask, published in 1976, SAKABE argued that modern Western philosophers assume the self-identical ego and take the world of representation to the subject, what is called the metaphysics of presence. This modern obsession misses the important sense of metamorphosis in philosophy. He presented our current situation as follows, I quote, "It is not simple for us today to awaken and recollect such experience or feelings that shake our ordinary flat sense of real thing and its shadow in the deeper phase. Experiences where we suffer some mixed feelings of awe and fear in recognizing the higher revelation of reality in one's avatar, other, and shadow, which are most deeply related to our own self. And situations where our ordinary flat sense of reality is reversed between light and dark, and where a part of shadow, which is passed unnoticed in everyday life, start to speak with a vivid sense of reality." End quote. To put forward an alternative, SAKABE examines the Japanese word kage, shadow. We may sometimes recognize in kage an appearance of a higher reality, as one may see there a part of and the other of our own self, alter ego. He then reminded us of Plato's simile of the cave along with the material imagination of Gaston Bachelard. SAKABE suggested a fusion or interchange between kage and reality. Kage is not just an inferior appearance of the real object, but contains the potential power of fundamentally shaking our consciousness and ordinary sense of reality. It awakens us and may lead us back to our origin. The Japanese kage means shadow or image, but also light. On the surface of water, it reflects UTSU, the world. SAKABE discussed the etymological connotation of utsushi, which comes from utsuru, to transfer. Utsuru basically means something emerging at another place with the same form and content. Therefore, its basic meaning is, first, a projection of the very form or shape on another place. Second, a color or scent transferred to another thing. And third, an evil spirit possesses something. In the last sense, utsuru may imply an emergence of the divine or soul through divination, and a mysterious experience that someone becomes another. Its derivative word, utsutsu, means reality, but SAKABE noted that it does not correspond to presence in Western traditional metaphysics. Rather, it signifies transition or interaction between absence and presence, life and death, the invisible or formless and the visible and form. Between them, we see no absolute hierarchy, since they reflect each other and transform between themselves to maintain an identity of utsutsu. Therefore, utsutsu occasionally overlaps with or changed into yume, dream, as in the phrase yume utsutsu, half asleep, half awake, or trance. This dynamic relation and balance constitute a reality, and therefore, transfer or metaphor is an essential factor of the world. For SAKABE, although Plato is still the origin of Western metaphysics, he is at the same time a rich source of alternatives, just as he saw in the old Japanese thoughts. His criticism of Western philosophy shed light on Plato as its origin. With reference to the simile of the cave, SAKABE pursued the interaction and transfer metaphor between thing and shadow and self and object. The self is not self-identical, as modern Western philosophers assume. This dynamic and flexible view on reality and the self points to a philosophical motivation of Plato, that is, to shake our ordinary sense of reality, to reveal another phase, and to intimate another possibility of I. This dynamism is what SAKABE believes philosophy should consider. On the other hand, SAKABE tried to avoid hierarchical structuring of beings and rejected any idea of fixing the different stages, in particular Platonism, as traditionally understood. So he went so far as to suggest radical interpenetration or fusion between things and shadow, self and other, and reality and dream, which represent a typical Japanese thinking as we see in no place. 3. Plato's philosophy as experiencing the ideas. IZUTSU Toshihiko taught at Keio University in Tokyo, the Iranian Research Institute of Philosophy in Tehran, and McGill University in Montreal. As an active participant in Eranos from Japan, he obtained a global reputation as a specialist in Sufism and Eastern philosophy. In Mystic Philosophy, a study on Greek philosophy, published in 1949, he tried to interpret Greek philosophy in terms of mysticism. This original approach illuminates one important aspect of Plato that has been neglected in Western scholarship, namely idea experience as transformation of our soul. IZUTSU was born and brought up in a strong familiar atmosphere of the East. In youth, he discovered in Greek philosophy the crucial hints for making religious experience into words, logos. In Eastern philosophy, especially Zen Buddhism, words and speech tend to be disbelieved and avoided. They say, Gonsen Fukyu, that truth cannot be reached through words and speech, and Furyumonji, that spiritual enlightenment cannot be attained with words and letters. However, IZUTSU believed that Greek thinkers had similar spiritual experiences as Eastern mystics, but unlike the latter, they succeeded in making their experience philosophy by means of logos. IZUTSU treated Plato as the first culmination of Greek mystic philosophy. Plato's philosophy completed the Orphic and Pythagorean mysticism of salvation of the soul. Taking the theory of ideas as realization of mystic philosophy, IZUTSU claimed that Plato's dialecticians are nothing other than mystics, and that idea experiences must precede the theory of ideas. Studying the mystic tradition in both the West and the East, IZUTSU rehabilitated the philosophical role of the image. In his masterpiece, Consciousness and Essence, published in 1983, he classified and examined three types of Oriental, of which the second is the symbolist philosophy, including different forms of mysticism. He argued that this tradition takes the archetypal images in the subconscious domain to be to be the universal essence of reality, to be evoked through poetic or mythopoetic imagination. IZUTSU first pointed out that human consciousness as a whole is image productive and full of images. The mystic tradition of Oriental philosophy sees image experience as a kind of reality experience. For example, shamanism experiences the real world as appearing as a world of images. IZUTSU introduced the notion of the imaginal world, which is more real than what we ordinarily see as a real world, as a core in the mystic and Platonist tradition. When he discussed Sufrawardi, the 12th century Persian Sufi philosopher, he discussed the image as follows, I quote, "For men of common sense who see things from the empirical basis, the metaphor, which lacks a material basis, is nothing but the likeness, namely a shadow thing. But from another viewpoint, this shadowy entity turned out to have far denser existence than real thing in our empirical world. For Sufrawardi and thinkers of shamanism, Gnosticism, Tantrism, the things in what we call the real world are nothing but literally shadowy entities or shadows of shadow. The true weight of reality lies in the metaphor. Otherwise, how can we explain the overwhelming reality, for example, of the tantric mandala space, which consists only of images?" End quote. In the hierarchy of realities, Sufrawardi posited the independent intermediary world, which is governed by the cognitive power of imagination, but nevertheless is more real than the sensible world. From this, IZUTSU took hints as to rehabilitate the notion of images for the understanding of our deep consciousness. He pointed out the interesting fact that several philosophers of Islamic mysticism, namely Sufrawardi, Ibn Arabi, and Mullah Sadra, regarded themselves as followers of Plato's philosophy and as interpreting his theory of ideas in a new form. By examining different stages or levels of reality and the self based on Eastern philosophy, IZUTSU aimed to return to the deeper phase of the undifferentiated state of our unconsciousness, far below our ordinary consciousness. He showed another extreme direction of Platonism, which ends in mystic unification with the absolute. 4. Plato's philosophy as encounter with ideas. INO-UE Tadashi lectured at the University of Tokyo and seriously challenged Plato and Aristotle to engage in philosophy with them. He first studied Plato's later dialogues intensively, of which the main articles are included in his book Challenge from Konkyo, published in 1974. Inoue's attitudes towards the philosophy of Plato is clearly stated in one of his essays. I quote, "Of course, I seek a way to understand the ideas, but the approach to it is not to discuss what the ideas are in the history of philosophy. That is only a reference and a point to consider. What counts is that we should truly encounter them, and that we clearly see what we encounter in the way of doing philosophy." End quote. He identifies the true philosophy with idei, namely encounter with the ideas. The ideas are what grounds our reality and are therefore called konkyo. Konkyo is arche or ground or origin. Our reality is based or grounded on that thing behind, and we are grasped by the konkyo. Therefore, philosophers must recognize that we ourselves are part of it. The world of facts in which we live is different from what we seek in philosophy, namely konkyo. This is how Inoue interpreted Plato's theory of ideas. Plato suggested that we should separate ourselves from the confusing world of generation and encounter another horizon of reality, namely ideas. INO-UE understood that separation and participation, the two key terms of Platonic philosophy, indicate the relation between our factual world, apart, and the grounding konkyo, the whole. He proposed that participation, meteken, means being grasped from behind. I quote, "We must recognize that separatedness and kotonari, different, from our horizon lies in the idei, which are not our side but being separated from us." End quote. INO-UE contrived many puns in Japanese language, and idei is one of them. The Greek word plural idea and the Japanese word to encounter. He took our philosophical mission as to respond to the challenge from konkyo and to create ourselves as a work of konkyo. In another word, we must expose ourselves to konkyo and curve ourselves to become his son, kotonari. In this way, INO-UE understood philosophy not as a mere theoretical inquiry or systematic research, but as a hard way of living our own life in this world. Although INO-UE reached this position in the 1960s, he later changed and severely criticized Plato's philosophy as resorting to the kind of logos that withdraw into the soul. He argued that even if Plato encountered the ideas and saw the truth, so he believed, this turned out to be another belief. As far as Plato relied much on his own conviction of the encounter experience, he can never come out of the closed, private world of the soul. I think we should face his criticism of Plato, since it shows us how mystic understanding of Plato philosophy reached an impasse. INO-UE showed both a provocative and straight way of approaching Plato's ideas and its fundamental drawbacks. 5. The theory of ideas reconsidered. Studying Plato first at the University of Tokyo in Japan and next in Cambridge, the UK, I gradually realized that the essence of Plato's theory of ideas may be missing in the current philosophical studies. I emphasize the aspects of separation, purification, and transcendence as the cores of Plato's philosophy. We know that Aristotle identified separation of intelligible things from sensible things as essence in Plato's theory of ideas. This aspect was fully examined by Matsunaga Yuji, a Platonic scholar at Kyushu University and close friend of INO-UE Tadashi. Matsunaga analyzed the dynamism of separation in the following way. The ideas are separated from many changing and conflicting states of affairs. We should stand away from such conflictions. For example, that something is both just and unjust, or beautiful and ugly, to realize the absolute being of just or beautiful. The idea of beautiful is beautiful itself by itself. Here, separation is twofold. It is separated from many beautiful things on the one hand, and from the other ideas, such as ugliness and justice on the other. Following Matsunaga's interpretation, I would like to suggest that Plato also used the concept of separation in another way in the Phaedo. It also signifies the separation of the soul from the body in the definition of death. Socrates says that the philosopher does not concern himself with the body, but so far as he can, separates himself from it and concentrates upon the soul. This separation enables the soul to reach the higher cognitive states called wisdom concerning the ideas. When Socrates characterizes soul in terms of separation, he connects it with the ontological separation of the idea from the sensible things. Thus, the double use of the word separation for the soul and the ideas clarify the close relationship between the soul and ideas. The souls being alone by itself and the ideas being themselves by themselves stand or fall together. They are correlative and make a pair. We come to know that the ideas, when the soul gets separated from the body to be alone by itself. This separating process is called purification. Here, the two separations coincide to make an experience of transcendence. So look at the diagram. In this diagram, our initial state is at the bottom. The embodied soul perceives sensible objects, which both are and are not so and so. Then, as the soul becomes aware of something beyond these, it is separated and eventually becomes the true soul, that is, the intellect. Then it observes and knows purely the ideas, which always are. This shift from the bottom to the upper is a double change of the subject and the reality. This experience can be traditionally called transcendence. The theory of ideas indicates not only the transcendence of the object, but also transcending experience of the subject, namely ourselves. Therefore, although the ideas may appear to be unnecessary and mistake to the embodied soul in the corporeal world, once it gets separated, the intelligible world of ideas is revealed as its proper object. In other words, as a lower stage, we live everyday life with the bodily senses and opinions, but we can proceed to the higher stage where we contemplate the idea with knowledge and wisdom. I take transcendence and transformation of the subject as a response to care for the soul in Plato's apology of Socrates, since it means to convert from the bodily concern to a true self. The practice of death in the Phaedo signifies the same conversion of the soul from various earthly things such as property, honor, appearance, desire, and body to the true self. In the transcendence experience, the transformation of a soul into its original form, namely intellect, undergoes a complete change of view on reality, from confusing and conflicting sensibles to absolute and eternal ideas. When the soul is awakened, the world appears totally different, and only then does the sensible experience seem like a dream. The philosophy of Plato awakens our soul from the dreaming state and helps us go up to the contemplation of the ideas and transform ourselves. If this interpretation is correct, the theory of ideas is not just a theory about metaphysical entities, but an ethical practice of the soul. This is my present reading of Plato's theory of ideas, and you can see here some important influences from my Japanese predecessors. Plato has been a major philosopher who had had a great influence on Japanese thinking and society since the mid-19th century. We have already developed a new approach and proper reading for doing and living philosophy through philosophical dialogue with Plato. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Noburu. We've had some appreciative comments in the chat, including from Helsinki in Finland, so this is a truly international event. Just a reminder, if you'd like to pose a question, please enter it into the chat box. Try to make it fit into one entry in the chat. Try and make it as clear as possible as well. And we'll see if we can include some in our discussion. Now, I was actually reminded a bit of Plato's allegory of the cave, which I think most people are familiar with, the idea that if people live their whole lives in a cave seeing only shadows and they come out into the daylight, then the reality dazzles them and they don't believe it's reality. They believe in the shadows in the cave are the reality. And it just struck me that in a sense there's a similar thing about echo chambers, if you like, that and our different traditions can be certain echo chambers. And if you lived in the cave of purely Western scholarship of Plato, it's not that you'd be seeing just illusions and shadows, but you'd be so used to sort of seeing Plato in one particular way that if you were to go into a different echo, or a different sort of cave and have a different perspective, it can be quite dazzling. So I think there's quite a lot to unpack here, quite a lot that's quite challenging for those of us who have really only encountered Plato through Western interpretations. So I'm just going to ask quite a lot of questions which will help us to unpack a lot of the talk, which is extremely rich. And I want to start, Noburu, just with a fairly basic one right at the beginning. You talk about the empiricist sort of assumption in Western thought about considering reality, that we take experience, what is available, to be the basis of our experience. And I mean, some people might say that's not so much an assumption as a kind of a premise which we've worked hard towards. We've learned to become suspicious of non-empirical thinking and the existence of entities without any empirical basis from it. So I just wanted to say, could you say a little bit more about why you think we should be challenging this, and why we shouldn't just believe this is our emphasis on the empirical is a sign of a kind of a philosophical maturity, if you like?
Yeah, thank you very much, Julian. What I said, empirical assumption, is a kind of way of thinking, or way of looking at the world, from from this world. From our ordinary experience with our bodies, and so that kind of approach. If we start from this point, then Plato's ideas are just added entities. So I'd like to emphasize this, from where to look at the things is quite different. If you assume, I live in this world, and so the things I experience now, here and now, are, well, everything. That exclude the possibility of Plato's thinking. So that is my basic ideas.
Okay, so but I suppose the question I've got is that the response might be that's not so much an assumption as a reasonable premise, if you like. Why
Yeah,
should
yeah,
why
of
should
course.
some yeah? So why should someone who is sort of committed to that empirical view sort of like um, reconsider it, if you like?
Yeah, and of course, and well, though it's not easy even for me to proceed, change those who firmly believe that this is the only way, or only the right way to look at things. But I just suggest, there is another possibility, or another way of looking at the world. So that the Plato. So then you can see, which is more reasonable, or which you want to live in. So that kind of open up the possibilities. That is my intention. I do not believe that I can prove Plato's ideas is right or more correct than the empiricist one. But yeah, I just showed, just another way of looking.
Right, great. So yeah, so in a sense, it's just that one has to accept this is an assumption and shouldn't take it as an absolute truth.
Yeah,
Let me move
yeah,
on to this idea of the self-identical ego, which is an interesting one. This idea of the self as something which has a permanent, unchanging essence. And you mentioned SAKABE's idea of the self as a subject of metamorphosis in some way. Now, it seems to me, on my fairly slender understanding of some of the dominant trends in Asian philosophy, in particular, that this idea of the self as not being a stable, fixed subject is actually one which is a very widespread view. Could you say a little bit more about what it means to understand the self as something which is, as I say, a subject of metamorphosis?
yes. Thank you. Well, probably you're right that we have some Eastern thinking background, which the, which does not assume the very strong identical or identity of each self. For example, some Chinese thinkers like Lao Tzu and Taoism, the subject changed from human to another animal or some natural things. But that kind of things maybe Sakabe had in mind, in contrast to more individualistic notion of self as identity in Western philosophy. So I think that's a kind of real, very general contrast, and in Eastern philosophy has that kind of moving, changing, or even the distinction between I and things and I and you is not absolute. That's only relative. So that kind of things.
Yeah, just to follow up on that in a way, I suppose what's quite interesting is that you use the term soul quite a lot. And I think when you think of Plato and the soul, I think we associate that with precisely that kind of view of the self having some kind of unchanging, permanent essence. But are you suggesting that we should understand soul differently, not that we're misunderstanding what soul means here?
Oh, that's more on Plato's philosophy. Yeah. Of course, Plato discussed in the Phaedo that the soul transmigrate into one body to another body, that kind of things. But on the other hand, Plato discussed the world soul, the universe itself has a soul, and a kind of higher soul, or different kind of souls. So the Plato's successor, one of the successor, Plotinus, discusses the soul in a different stage, and the highest soul is not our, individualistic soul. It's a kind of the include everything in the world. So the soul, I suggest that soul is not just in individual unchanging essence or subject, but our soul is a part of the whole. So maybe my soul get into the original soul when uh, I die or something. So it's a kind of that kind of flexible view on the soul is already in Plato.
Let me just follow up on that too, because again, I think perhaps this relates to this empirical assumption. I think with this sort of empirical mindset, we hear the word soul and we hear these things and we assume, well, okay, you must be positing some kind of second substance in addition to material reality, and that this and if we don't have any particular reason though to think that substance exists because we don't find it in our empirical investigations, do we just do away with the concept of soul? So I suppose I'm still trying to understand whether or not, in order to even talk of souls in this way, we need to have an idea of a kind of substance which is a different kind of thing to the empirical substance of the world, or whether or not it's just that we need to look at the world through more than one lens, if you like, not just through the lens of a kind of empirical scientific way. Is that clear
Yeah.
enough, or is that too general a question?
Thank you. Well, you use the word dualism, and Plato is often called dualism, the two world. But the things in this sensible world and things in the ideal world are not on the same level. I mean, the sensible words are kind of copy or image of the image, the ideas, the ideal world. So the real substance is it's a reverse. We normally believe that the things I touch or things are real, but this is less real than the real things. So it's a kind of the change or reverse of our thinking. Uh, so that's why the criticism of Plato, like Aristotle, Plato added extra entity to the world. That is the opposite. So Plato did not added things, but Plato sees things of our experience in light of the other things. So yes, he doesn't added the second category of the things, but he changed to see our things, our worldly things. So that is a thing. So maybe a scientific lens. Yes, that's it's a different way of looking at the world. And Plato believes that the theory of ideas is more scientific than empirical things. Yeah, because he believes that mathematics is the more real than so mathematical world. So in a modern science like astronomy, the mathematical structure, mathematical and background is very real in the sense. So sorry.
Yeah, I'm going to just kind of persist, as it were, kind of representing this kind of. It's interesting, when we think about this very empirically minded, traditionally sort of stereotypically Western mindset. I think it's quite interesting to me how I can kind of see it in two ways. I can kind of like see it as from one side, from the inside, as just someone wanting to be sensible and evidence based and rational, and from the outside it can seem like someone being very 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 narrow and very kind of literal and sort of insisting that the only realities are those that can be studied through science. But I mean, I suppose I think most people, and I think this would be true, I assume, of yourself as well. I mean, pretty much everyone these days wants their metaphysical worldview, their beliefs, to sort of be compatible with our scientific understanding of the world. No one wants to hold a belief that sort of in any way conflicts with that. And how could we understand this idea that the most real things are forms rather than substantiated things in a way that doesn't conflict with, can be complementary to, but doesn't conflict with our scientific understanding of the world? Is that possible?
Well, of course, I'm not the pure Platonist, but I try to understand, what Plato believes. In your question, probably scientific worldview is part of the whole metaphysics. I mean, it's compatible, but not just compatible, but it's only a small part of the whole story. Because, for example, the the Plato's thinking was a kind of different stage, different level or dimension. So we live in the three-dimensional thing, world, and four-dimension, five-dimension, six dimensions, that kind of things. Higher dimension. That's his metaphysics. So in the higher dimensional world, then our experience is a part in a small part of the things. So I think they are compatible in that way.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm going to sort of take there's a question from the audience which may be a bit specific, but maybe I can use it as a kind of opening into another way of thinking. This is from our friend in Helsinki, who says he's asking whether the idea of chaos in Hesiod or logos in Heraclitus is about the same as emptiness, sunyata, dharmata, or Mahayana. Now, that might be a very specific question, and to answer it in a way that everyone can understand, you'd have to explain quite a lot about what those concepts are. But it does seem to me that the reason I think I'd like to put this question to you in a way is that you didn't specifically sort of mention sunyata, emptiness, although you did in passing, I think, say something along this. Well, first of all, these ideas of emptiness and sunyata, which have been very typical in Japanese thought, could you explain a little bit what they are? Do they relate to what you've been talking about today, and do they correspond to ideas we find in, say, Greek thought? That's a huge question. I'm sorry. I'm asking you to give a different
Yeah.
lecture, I think.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. Of course, on each side, we need quite a lot of an explanation. And as far as I see, the emptiness or nothingness in Japanese or Buddhist thought doesn't have the exact correspondence in Greek philosophy, chaos or flux of the world, that kind of thing is not nothing but emptiness as Buddhist thought. But on the other hand, it normally people normally assume that Western thinking and Eastern thinking is the opposite. The Western thinking, like Christian theology or Greek philosophy, is posited the absolute substance, eternal, unchanging substance. And Eastern Buddhist thought is emptiness, nothingness. So that contrast is not working well all the time, because as I said, the Western thought is not always the eternal unchanging things, the changing subject or dynamic structure of the thing. So in that sense, we see some similar thought in Eastern or Japanese thinking and Plato's or Greek philosophy. But the emptiness is one extreme basis. Maybe let me introduce one theory. The Nishida Kitaro, one of the most important Japanese philosophers, he proposed the logic of place. Logical place. Sounds strange, but logical space. He used Plato's Kora as that logic. So, and Japanese philosophers use Plato's ideas in the Timaeus. The Kora, the concept of Kora, is kind of key of Nishida Kitaro's Japanese thinking. So.
Okay, that's really interesting. I want to move on to this form about how the philosophy is a way of life. And I thought this is really interesting, but I think there's quite a lot more to unpack here in a way. Perhaps I'll go into that indirectly. INO-UE Tadashi had this idea about encountering ideas rather than understanding them. I think that's a really interesting distinction. What's the difference between encountering an idea and understanding it?
Understanding as a kind of intellectual activity is only a part of the encounter, probably, that he means. Because, for example, if you want to know someone, your friends or something else, you have a lot of knowledge, that he's about, his the age or a nationality or birthplace or something like that. That understanding, at least standard way of understanding people, but actually meet people and to grasp a kind of intuitional grasp is should be the basis of that understanding. So if we lack that kind of basic, understand, basic encounter, the understanding of the a lot of propositions are only formal, and we cannot really understand the idea. So that is it's more a kind of knowledge by acquaintance or something like that. It's a similar thing. So we have to see, we have to meet. That is in a way the idea. So it's a kind of mystic experience of something like that.
Yeah, I mean, to push that a little bit further again, I mean, you use the term sort of mystic experience. Again, I think that in Western philosophy, mystic has become a kind of a scary word. We want to kind of avoid that. But I wonder if there is a way of understanding that in a way that might make people more sympathetic. Because it does seem to me that, in my very limited knowledge of this, that Japanese thought places much more emphasis on, as it were, and the encounter, this sort of sense of experience, and this sort of idea that
Mm.
through language and concepts alone you can't get to the essence of things. Do we have to understand that as being kind of mystical, or is there perhaps a way of understanding it in which we don't have to think of mysticism? Oh, I mean, maybe we do, and maybe it's just a prejudice that we don't want to be mystical. But I'm just wondering
Mm.
if someone's struggling with the idea of a mystical experience, is there a way of explaining it to them which makes it sound a little less scary, maybe, or alien?
Yeah, and I must say that Inoue Tadashi himself didn't like the word mystic, so he didn't use the word, and I use it. Our IZUTSU Toshihiko, he used mystic a lot, and you're right that mystic or mysticism has a lot of different connotations and misleading word. Experience. Yeah, its experience is perfectly all right for Inoue's case. Inoue's is I experience or as ideas, but from outside, it's very difficult to say what's happening. For example, like a religious experience of revelation, or and that kind of things. Um, yeah, but that kind of experience can be obtained through, of course, there's dialogues or practice or that kind of thing. So it's not automatically comes from anywhere, but the real experience is the core. So it's yeah. Again, and we don't have to stick to the notion of mystic here.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps another way to look into this. So you mentioned Gansen Fukyu, and this idea that truth cannot be reached through words and speech. Is part of this sort of emphasis on what we've got mysticism simply
Hmm.
the consequence of a view in which we accept that language and concepts are not always sufficient to capture the whole of reality.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and of course there's a few different ways to treat to regard words and speech. Zen Buddhism and some Buddhist tradition has very much against our verbal or thinking activities, because that's a cause of our mistake, or they believe. So they try to avoid any that kind of thinking or using words, so then concentrate or meditate or some things. So that is one extreme case. But Izutsu or Inoue Tadashi, when they discuss Plato, of course they did not exclude dialogue or logical thinking or reasoning. So I think it's one possible way of rehabilitate Plato's philosophy in Japanese way is it's of course using dialogue or reasoning to get experience. So that kind of thing. So the combination is perfectly all right.
Yeah. Okay, really interesting stuff. Towards the end, you talked about these separations, the separation of soul and body, and purification. Now, I want to ask a little bit more about this idea of
Mhm.
separation of soul. And I think this relates to a question we got here from our viewer who goes under the name of Digital Gnosis. He says, "What asking what you think of this soul in the light of modern neurosciences, brain and mind." So I suppose what we would say is, what when you talk about the separation of the soul, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about the separation of a one thing from another, or are we thinking about separation in another sense? And again, how do we make that kind of fit in with what we understand about the nature of mind on the basis of things like neuroscience?
Mm. Neuroscience. Yeah. Uh, when Plato discussed the separation of the soul from the body, and he also used another image of changing the direction of the care. We are normally care for the money or care for the body, but we have to change to the care for the soul. So, and kind of looking at the the attitudes towards things are different from, and if as long as we have body and soul together, then we have a lot of concern about our bodily things and something. But if we try practice and try to avoid those kind of bodily extra concerns, then we can concentrate on the purely theoretical or logical or reasonable things. So that is a separation. So neuroscientific way, I don't know how to say, but I think probably you can you can put it in more scientific way because our neuroscientific mind operation is just to avoid the bodily concern, but to focus on the purely reasonable, rational side of our mental activities. Does this make
Right. So
sense?
yeah, I think it does. Let's just check I have made sense of it. So what you're saying is that, let's say I'm pretty convinced that there is no soul as some kind of substance or something, and that
Yeah.
I am in basically a physical entity, thoughts, the mind. But the separation you're talking about isn't necessarily
Mm.
a separating two things. It's a separating certain aspects of my existence and putting the focus on the
Yes.
one which is most important. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
Okay.
that's
Good.
fine. Yes. Yeah. Mm.
How does that
Yeah.
work for
So
the other separation though, between ideas and instantiated things? I mean,
yeah.
so I think most people can understand that. Okay, to make that separation of soul, intellect, whatever you might kind of think are higher capacities from our mere
Mm.
animal nature, and to focus on that is an ethical practice, as you say. How is it an ethical practice to focus on ideas rather than instantiated objects?
Yes, I think the two things come together. I mean, the separation of the soul from the body and the separation of the ideas from the sensible things. So that's coincide. That is my diagram, and I think this is the same way, neuroscientific way. Probably one can explain. When I purely concentrate on my intelligence or the rational things, then I can perceive the world more deeply and not just my sense perception, but the structure of the world or the more I don't know. Not special temporal way, more higher theoretical way. So that's a change of our understanding of the world. Come together with the separation of the soul. So I think that's quite reasonable explanation. I myself changed into the pure intellect. Then what I see is changed from the sensible ordinary things to the something else.
Okay, so and so this is the way in which philosophy then therefore becomes a way of life, because you're changing the way you
Yes, yeah,
relate to
yeah,
yourself and the
yes.
world. Yeah, yeah. As something to be commended on or not commended. Again, I think some people might think that when one talks about this separation and the focus on the transcendent soul, it sounds very noble. It sounds very very sounds noble. It sounds like a high aspiration. Some people might say though that in a way, maybe the mistake here is though that we live in a world of messy empirical reality. That is what life is like, and that the attraction of living on a plane where we're pure intellect, pure ideas, it's very seductive. But that's kind of that's an illusion, because actually the world is a world of changing, messy, imperfect things. How would you respond to that worry?
Yeah, yeah, that's of course. And I live in this world, and I use things around me. And well, in that case, as Plato's simile of the cave, the last stage of that simile will answer. Yeah, because the someone who were born and living in the cave. Once get out of the cave and saw the true reality, but he or she return into the cave again and live there. So that is the final stage of the cave analogy. So that is Plato's proposal of philosopher king, philosopher ruler, and what does it mean? Yes, and well, having that experience, idea experience, we can see this sensible world slightly differently or slightly clearly in what's happening. And so living in the same world with my neighbors, friends and other people, but seeing the same things differently. So that is the hopeful result of the experience, idea experience. What kind of things happen? For example, normally we see one activity, one action, or one person, just one, the people. Well, we say that okay, everything is gray, so there's no black and white. So that is our starting point. Our sensible world is both confusing and changing, so we cannot say definitely either. But once we really see the real things, the justice itself or something, then we can see how much justice or how just, how unjust each particular case is. So we can distinguish or we can discern these things in the light of the ideas. So the same life in this sensible world will change. So that is one answer Plato gives in the simile of analogy, simile of the cave.
Yeah, that is interesting, isn't it? People perhaps forget that part of the story is you go back into the cave. That's the kind of
Yeah,
the
of course.
point.
Philosopher didn't want to go return to that, okay. But we have a body. We cannot get out of the body completely as long as I live. So yeah, it's necessary.
Yeah. Well, actually, I mean, perhaps I'll just invite you a question from Tamas. Is interesting here, and it's just an invitation because we've talked about the metaphor, the cave. Perhaps you could say something about how you see the sun metaphor, which is sort of comes together with the cave. Perhaps if you could just remind people of that metaphor and how you understand that, how you think the best way to understand that is.
Yes, thank you very much. Sun. Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't thought of this, any special way of understanding the sun metaphor, but uh, Western philosophy from well, not only Plato, but from earlier thinkers, the sun is a kind of the symbol of the everything's and the origin or something. But in Japanese traditional thought, we don't have that kind of very strong image of the sun. And so, like Sakabe Megumi, every shadow and real things change into each other. So it's a kind of very more misty thing. So it's for Japanese traditional thinking, the Plato or Western metaphysics, it's very clear cut. The light and dark, or sun and night, or the day and night, or that kind of things. It's clear. Opposite case. But in Japanese thinking, so we don't have that kind of clear contrast with a more nuance or interchange of the light and dark, or that kind of thing. Well, interesting how Japanese philosophers understand the sun image, but we don't have the same things in as far as I know, Japanese philosophy.
Okay, thanks so much indeed. There's loads of interesting sort of comments. I think some people like to hear about some quite specific things, and I kind of think to myself that it's been unfair just to ask you, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? So, just for example, Dr. Kanyan Pukiyashita wants to know your thoughts about Nichida Kitaro, who's a very well-known philosopher there. But I'm not sure it's really fair to ask you to sort of saying, unless there is anything in particular. Is there anything in particular about Kitaro's thought which relates to your talk today?
Not well. I didn't discuss Nishida Kitaro, but I mentioned in your talk. I mean, Nishida was also partly influenced by Plato's thought, and when he constructed in his middle stage of his philosophical career, when he introduced the logical place, Basho no Ronri, he used Plato's Kora in the Timaeus. Why? Because he tried to overturn the Aristotelian logic. So the Aristotelian logic, subject and predicate, that kind of logic is very limited. So how to change our way of thinking, logic? Then we should overturn Aristotelian logic. Then he go back to Plato. So that kind of interesting connection was seen in Nishida. Nishida was not very much fan of Plato, actually, but but still, he used a lot of Plato's ideas.
Okay, I'm just going to ask one final question, which is inspired by several different comments in the chat. It is the case that in Japanese, there's something called, referred to sometimes, the asymmetry of ignorance, which is that Western philosophers tend to be very ignorant of philosophy outside of the West, but philosophers outside of the West tend to be very knowledgeable about Western philosophy. But if you think about what Western philosophy has been of particular interest in Japan, there's been a lot of interest in phenomenology and in particular Heidegger. And I just wanted to ask you, why do you think that is that? Why is there an affinity, if you like, between the kind of Heideggerian phenomenology and traditional Japanese thought? What's the point of connection there?
A good question. Yes, and, of course. We have, for example, my department of philosophy as Western philosophy, basically history of Western philosophy. One of my colleagues is a specialist in Heidegger, and there is one reason is the historical connections. As several Japanese philosophers, young philosophers, staying in Germany with Heidegger and directly taught by him. And they introduce Heideggerian way of thinking. And for example, Watsuji Tetsuro, Kuki and Miki Kiyoshi. So there's personal connection. And Heidegger also mentioned Japanese philosophy in one of his work. So it's a kind of historical connection. But also, there's some parallelism between the early part of the 20th century's philosophy in Germany and Japan. The social situation is very similar, and a cultural situation is similar before the war. So I think something in common. And Japanese philosophers like German philosophy more than and Anglo-American philosophy, because our image of philosophy is kind of deep, the profound, and systematic philosophy. So that is the image. So still, Japanese philosophers, more inclined to study German background. Now it's changing. It's more Anglo-analytic philosophers strong in our department. But so there's some interesting reasons, but for Japanese people's preference of the philosophers, Western philosophers, and also China or Korea. They have their own preference, and so it's not monolithic. East Asian countries each has a different tradition and interest in Western philosophy, and the combination of traditional thought and Western philosophy. So in the case of Japan, the phenomenology and Heidegger is one of that example.
Thank you so much, Noburu, Professor Notomi. Really fascinating talk. I think for really interesting, and again for people you may be familiar with Plato, one of the philosophers who's taught first in any introductory book contains him, and you kind of think you know him, but very, very rich and have got a different way of understanding him. I'll give you plenty of food for thought. Just a reminder of some of the things we got coming up in our series. We have another 2 weeks before our Christmas break, talks by Nilanjan Das and also Eileen John. And we also have our annual London lecture with Sally Haslanger, and also our annual Edinburgh lecture, which is given by Heather Douglas. You can find all of these on our YouTube page. There's also on our Facebook page. And of course, the Royal Institute of Philosophy website, there's a mailing list you can sign up to so you don't miss a thing. Thank you for everyone coming today, but thank you, of course, primarily to our speaker, Notomi Noburu. Thank you.